Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. In these micro-lectures, part 1 and 2, we will explore inclusive education. This concept has become a cornerstone of government policy in shaping education systems in two large post-Soviet countries, Kazakhstan and Russia. Our discussion will focus on 6 main subtopics that provide a comprehensive view of inclusive education: historical legacies, legal and policy frameworks, teacher development and professional capacity, cultural concepts and social attitudes, resources, and infrastructure assessment of the current situation in Russia and Kazakhstan. Each of these areas highlights both the opportunities and the challenges that post-Soviet countries face as they work to transform historically exclusive education systems into inclusive ones. Before we dive into these subtopics, let us clarify what inclusive education actually means. According to the World Bank Group in 2025, inclusive education involves creating systems and environments that enable all students to have equal access to learning. Similarly, UNICEF in 2025 emphasizes that inclusive education is the most effective way to ensure that all children have a fair chance to attend school and develop the skills they need for real-life success. However, the World Bank Group in 2025 also notes a persistent challenge. Despite global focus on inclusive education, many marginalized students, particularly in low and middle-income countries, continue to fall behind, often not achieving the learning outcomes they deserve. In this lecture, we will explore how Kazakhstan and Russia are addressing these challenges and what lessons we can draw for building more inclusive, equitable education systems in the 21st century. Let us now turn to the historical context of inclusive education in post-Soviet countries. During the Soviet era, the dominant framework for addressing disability in education was known as defectology. According to the Wikipedia dictionary, the term comes from the Latin defectus, meaning deficiency, and the Greek logos, meaning teaching or science. Defectology was a scientific discipline that studied the psychophysical development of children with mental or physical disabilities, including the laws of their education and upbringing. Researchers Kozlova and Ryabichenko described defectology as a medical model that pathologized disability and contributed to the segregation of students with special needs. This approach emphasized diagnosis and remediation rather than inclusion, and its legacy continues to influence education systems today. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 15 former Soviet republics began to develop their education systems independently. In Russia, the concept of inclusive education was formally introduced in the federal law on education of December 29, 2012, which guarantees equal access to education for all students, taking into account diverse special educational needs and individual capabilities. Currently, inclusive education in Russia is still at a developmental stage. Psychological, medical, and pedagogical commissions assess students and determine whether they should be placed in general or specialized educational settings. However, implementation is hindered by legislative gaps, which reduces the effectiveness of these commissions. As Vakorina et al. Note, strengthening legislative frameworks is essential to align Russia's inclusive education practices with international standards. In Kazakhstan, children with disabilities have traditionally been educated in private or specialized institutions or at home. Home education, however, often does not provide a realistic social and learning environment. Human Rights Watch reports that many children are excluded from mainstream education despite the country's formal commitment to inclusion. In practice, psychological, medical, and pedagogical commissions frequently act as gatekeepers, limiting classroom access for students with special needs. This shared Soviet legacy has created systemic barriers to inclusion. As highlighted by the Scottish Child Inclusion Research into Curriculum Learning Education, the continued dominance of medical classification over social or rights-based models has significantly slowed progress toward inclusive education. Understanding this historical backdrop is crucial to recognizing the challenges and opportunities that Kazakhstan and Russia face today in transforming their education systems to be truly inclusive. For more context on the challenges faced by children with disabilities in Kazakhstan, you can watch the video Kazakhstan, Education Barriers for Children with Disabilities. It provides a clear illustration of the obstacles to inclusive education in real classroom and community settings. Here is the link. Watch the video. This resource will help you understand the practical and social barriers that policies alone cannot address and complements our discussion of historical and systemic challenges. Next, let us examine the legal and policy frameworks supporting inclusive education in Kazakhstan and Russia. Both countries have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, aligning their policies with global norms for inclusive education. In Russia, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities were ratified in 2012, and inclusive education was codified into national legislation through the Federal Law on Education. This law guarantees that all children, including those with disabilities, have the right to education in mainstream schools. Additionally, the federal state educational standards recommend curriculum adaptations to meet the needs of students with special educational needs. Despite more than a decade since formal implementation, research by Hansen and Alexeva indicates that inclusive education in Russia remains underdeveloped. However, Kozyreva identifies the specifics of educational processes for students with different disability profiles, highlighting not only the existing challenges, but also potential strategies to enhance effectiveness. The key problem appears to be that strong legal provisions do not always translate into consistent practice. In Kazakhstan, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities were ratified in 2015, and significant policy efforts have been made to align national education with inclusive goals. The Law on Education from 2007 guarantees equal access, and the Concept for the Development of Inclusive Education for 2025 to 2030 aims to integrate nearly all children with special educational needs into mainstream schools by 2030. However, policy ambition does not always translate into practice. Makoele and Burmistrova describe Kazakhstan's legal environment as aspirational rather than fully operationalized. Teacher education institutions lack unified strategies, specific courses, and practical exposure for preparing future teachers to work in inclusive classrooms. As a result, graduates often enter schools underprepared to meet the diverse needs of learners. In both countries, research shows a disconnect between legal frameworks and lived educational experience. Kamenopoulou notes that while legal infrastructure exists, without comprehensive implementation, the law's impact remains limited. Addressing this gap is essential for transforming inclusive education from policy rhetoric into practice. Next, we turn to teacher training and professional capacity, which are critical for the success of inclusive education. Teachers are the foundation of effective inclusion, yet both Russia and Kazakhstan face significant challenges in preparing educators for diverse classrooms. In Russia, teacher education still emphasizes remedial pedagogy rooted in Soviet defectology. Baranov et al. Note that many mainstream teachers are not adequately prepared for inclusive settings. Training in differentiated instruction, assistive technologies, and inclusive classroom management is limited. While some specialized programs exist, they often reinforce traditional medicalized approaches rather than fostering inclusive pedagogy. Consequently, many teachers perceive inclusive education as difficult or inappropriate for mainstream schools. In Kazakhstan, inclusive education is a relatively new concept in teacher training. Makoele and Burmistrova highlight that although the government recognizes its importance, most university programs offer minimal modules on inclusive pedagogy. Teachers often enter classrooms without the skills to adapt curricula or meet the diverse needs of students. Buchanan and Fox argue that inclusive practice begins with recognizing diversity as normal and valuable. If educators are not trained to view differences positively, inclusion risks being performative rather than transformative. In both countries, there is an urgent need to revamp teacher education systems by integrating inclusive values, providing training in differentiated pedagogy, offering practical strategies for applying these approaches in real classrooms, Strengthening professional capacity is essential to transform inclusion from policy rhetoric into meaningful educational practice. Thank you for your attention. For further reading, please refer to the references listed on the last slide. See you in Week 5, Part 2, micro-lecture about inclusive education in post-Soviet contexts, a comparative analysis of Kazakhstan and Russia.